And I think we are all assembled now. Wayne, can you hear us? And can we hear you?
Do you hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you, Wayne.
Okay, good.
Great. It's a little soft. Is there any way you could get a little closer to the microphone?
How's that? Is that any better?
Yeah, that's a little better. Thank you. So I think with that, we can get started. So welcome everyone to a panel discussion on the question of Bonapartism. How is the state revolutionary? Hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society. I'm your moderator.
I can't hear anything.
Oh.
I can't hear anything.
That's strange. Spencer, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I can't hear anything. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Helena.
Oh.
Is it fixed now, Helena?
Are we all good, Helena? Is everything working
Hear
out?
us now?
They're little red sort of things. Little button, little red, looks like microphones with that are red with a line through them next to all of you. But when I click on them, nothing happens.
Oh,
right.
Yes, that just means it's muted.
Helena might have to change her loudspeaker setting.
Oh, that. Are you not
Hello,
able?
can you hear me now? Yes?
Yeah.
Oh, great. No, but I can't hear you. Oh, wait, that's the point. You can hear me, but I can't hear you. I heard you before.
Can you hear us now, Helena? Can you hear us now? I'm wondering,
Wait,
does anyone who's handling the tech here, does anyone have an idea of what might be happening?
Yeah, since it was working before,
Really?
I think maybe it just, you were hearing, yeah, she was hearing us before, so I think maybe she should just leave and rejoin.
Here we go.
You can
sorry.
get it? You got it?
All right.
Okay, all right, great.
It was pinging when I get an email, so I turned my actual laptop off. Sorry about that.
Okay,
Okay.
yeah, no problem.
All
That's
right,
good.
here we
That's
go.
a good problem for us to have easily fixed. That's good.
Sorry.
Okay, so we'll get started. So again, welcome to our panel discussion on Bonapartism, How is the State Revolutionary, being hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society. I'm your moderator at Remus, and this event is part of Platypus's 12th annual convention. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. We have chapters around the world, from Los Angeles to Leipzig, Austin to Athens, Chicago to Shanghai. During the current lockdown, we're hosting a number of online reading groups and panel events such as this one. Starting next week, we're hosting 3 Introduction to Platypus virtual reading groups via Zoom, as well as our regular primary Marxist syllabus in different locations. To find out more about how to join an online reading group, go to platypus1917.org/virtual. As part of this weekend's virtual convention, we're also hosting one additional panel discussion on the question of socialism in the 21st century that will take place live on Zoom beginning at 6 p.m. today Central Time. The link will be posted in the chat before the end of this discussion, and we hope you can all join us there. We also publish a monthly open submission journal, the Platypus Review. The latest issue, number 125, focuses on environmentalism and the left, and it's online now, so check it out. If you'd like to submit an article to the Platypus Review, please send an email to editor@platypus1917.org. We would love to hear from you. You can also check out our podcast, Shit Platypus Says, for your dose of the commentary on the left. The podcast is published regularly on SoundCloud and Apple Podcasts. Please share, subscribe, and give us a review. For today's panel, each panelist will have about 12 minutes for opening remarks and then 3 to 4 minutes to respond to one another. We will then have plenty of time for a Q&A discussion. When we go to the panelists' responses to each other, I'll ask those of you in the audience to begin submitting your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please use your name when submitting a question, and then I will read your questions out loud for the panelists to respond, so the panelists needn't worry about tracking that. This panel discussion poses the question of Bonapartism. How is the state revolutionary? To frame this question, we begin with a quote from Karl Marx. The empire, with the coup d'etat for its birth certificate, universal suffrage for its sanction, and the sword for its scepter, professed to rest upon the peasantry, the large mass of producers not directly involved in the struggle of capital and labor. It professed to save the working class by breaking down parliamentarism, and with it, the undisguised subserviency of government to the propertied classes. It professed to save the propertied classes by upholding their economic supremacy over the working class. And finally, it professed to unite all classes by reviving for all the chimera of national glory. That's a quote from Marx's 1871 work, The Civil War in France. So although it has largely fallen out of use today, Bonapartism was a term that Marx coined to link the bourgeois revolution, industrial society, and mass democracy directly with the politics of state power. Later, Marxists applied the concept of Bonapartism to 20th century political phenomena ranging from fascism to Stalinism to progressive liberalism. What is the revolutionary character of the modern state, if there is one? And what should the left do about or with the state? Joining us to discuss these questions are Helena Rosenblatt, Wayne Price, and Spencer Leonard. Helena Rosenblatt is professor of history at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Her many books include Liberal Values, Benjamin Constant, and the Politics of Religion, Thinking with Rousseau, from Machiavelli to Schmitt, and in 2018, The Lost History of Liberalism, from Ancient Rome to the 21st Century. Wayne Price is a former member of the International Socialists associated with Hal Draper, who moved to anarchism in his later life. He is the author of The Abolition of the State, Anarchist and Marxist Perspectives, Anarchism and Socialism, Reformism or Revolution, and thirdly, Value of Radical Theory, an anarchist introduction to Marx's critique of political economy. And finally, Spencer Leonard teaches history at the University of Virginia. He is a founding member of Platypus, one-time editor of the Platypus Review, and he currently serves on its organizational committee. He's the editor of the forthcoming book, Marx and Engels on Imperialism, Selected Journalism, 1851 to 62. And with that, we'll turn it over to Helena for the first opening presentation, followed by Wayne and Spencer, approximately 12 minutes, and I'll give you a little signal to indicate how you're doing on time. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here. I was a little bit surprised to hear that Marx coined the term. And so you'll tell me about when that happened. When you do an engram, and I've done a few, and of course there are problems involved with engrams, but when you do an engram, it tracks pretty closely to Caesarism. So for me, the way the words were used were almost synonyms of each other, referring to the rule of Louis Napoleon or Napoleon III. So please do correct me if I'm wrong about that, but they track each other and seem to peak around 1872 or something like that. So I'm going to proceed with that in mind. I know that you invited me, I think, to a talk like this on Caesarism, and I wasn't able to make it. But to me, as I said, Bonapartism is at least very similar. And again, I'd be happy to hear why not from the discussion. Now, as you know, I'm a historian. And so I'm going to here give a little historical perspective on the concept of Bonapartism when I think it was born. As you just mentioned, I've just come out with a book called The Lost History of Liberalism. And in that book, I take a conceptual approach to liberalism. That is, I don't look at a canon of the great thinkers. I don't try to retroactively and in what I call an anachronistic way impose our view of liberalism on the past and then track how certain ideas get developed over time. Rather, I look at how the concept of liberalism was used by people at the time, what it meant to them, what it meant to be liberal, and how this changed over time. So I'm looking at Bonapartism the same way. I'm curious about the concept, when it became really used, and what did people mean by that. Now, my idea is that liberalism, from my studies, the word was coined and the concept theorized around 1812. And the first theorists were among the first theorists were Benjamin Constant and Madame de Staël. And I would say that they were a reaction against liberalism. Was coined and theorized against the rule of Napoleon I. It was a way to kind of tame or make sure that Bonapartism Napoleon's authoritarian rule could not happen again. Caesarism was coined in 1851, and I was under the impression that Bonapartism was as well, and that, again, that they were quite similar or synonyms of each other. Now, what I'm going to propose here in my talk is that the two, liberalism and Bonapartism, were really kind of mirror images of each other, if you want. Liberalism was conceived as a reaction against Napoleon's rule, and then Bonapartism was invented, if you will, again as a reaction to liberalism. So a kind of a relationship where they are they're kind of locked in a hostile embrace. Now, Benjamin Constant dealt with this profound paradox, which was that the French Revolution, which was meant to be a movement of emancipation, ended up with a regime more authoritarian than it had replaced, namely the authoritarian rule of Napoleon I. And this is a rule that Madame de Staël called a monstrous despotism, and Benjamin Constant called usurpation, basically. And as I said, it was coined, the word liberalism was coined around 1812, and it was theorized by Benjamin Constant in his works, in particular, Principles of Politics Applicable to All Governments, where he wanted precisely to prevent a kind of regime such as Bonaparte had that he had instigated, or that was going on during Napoleon. That is, a liberal constitution was one that was proclaimed rule of law, civil equality, but also true representative government, constitutional representative government with a number of individual rights, among which the right to free speech and press were the most important, usually, but also the enjoyment of property. And now I should say that liberalism was never democratic, or not democratic at this time, at the time of its birth. Benjamin Constant and Madame de Staël and many of their partners and their colleagues had seen what happened during the revolution and thought that the crowd had conducted itself in a very irrational manner, that it had been very violent. During the terror had been the most democratic stage of the revolution. It had also been the most bloody. And then Napoleon had come along, who had been very popular. He had legitimized his rule repeatedly with plebiscites, so they thought the crowd was not only irrational and prone to violence, but also very vulnerable to despots and demagogues who appealed to their lowest instincts and against everybody's best interests. So it was, again, a reaction to Napoleon I's rule. Now, Bonapartism, I feel, is a reaction to that. Napoleon III styled himself as a Caesar, and he owed his power and his prestige to his uncle, the first Napoleon. He wanted to portray himself in a similar way as a heroic and inspirational leader, and even his coup d'etat in 1851 was called the Operation Rubicon. Of course, as you all know, Marx said in his 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon that history repeats itself, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. And his rule generated a heated debate across Europe about what his kind of rule was. And they thought of it as a new and hybrid form of despotism. Alexis de Tocqueville said it was something new. The thing itself is new. He couldn't use dictatorship. He didn't use tyranny. He didn't use Bonapartism, but he said this is something new. And many people thought of it as this hybrid form of despotism, which was neither right-wing nor left-wing. It was both a police state that you implemented certain authoritarian aspects such as surveillance and censorship, exile. On the other hand, it was also quite economically progressive in that it did quite a bit for workers as well. So conservatives were happy with the third Napoleon III, for reestablishing order after the revolution of 1848. And some socialists liked him too. He had offered workers soup kitchens, insurance, price controls on bread, orphanages, nurseries, hospitals, festivals, prize-giving ceremonies, inexpensive housing, and he'd even sent a delegation of workers to the London exhibition of 1862. So, he really himself fancied himself or portrayed himself as someone above politics, somebody who had this connection, some direct connection with workers, with people, with everybody. He was going to unite France. And that was also kind of modeled on his uncle, the first Napoleon. Of course, his rule, both the first Napoleon and his nephew, were the worst nightmare liberals could imagine, liberals like Benjamin Constant and Alexis de Tocqueville. He really perverted and turned upside down everything they stood for. And so they wanted to stop that, and they wrote a lot against his rule. Now, Benjamin Constant wrote this great text, Conquest and Usurpation, in 1814, on conquest and usurpation of 1814, which was a very strong anti-Napoleonic text. So he was really a critic of the first Napoleon, and he was incredibly astute, psychologically astute thinker, and kind of prophetic in a way, because what he described in this wonderful text is something that sounds very much actually like Bonapartism. And so now, if you don't mind, I'm going to turn quickly to read something that I prepared so that I stay within the time given to me, sort of, and show you how we can see Bonapartism or Caesarism as this kind of mirror or opposite of liberalism by looking at the text of Benjamin Constant on conquest and usurpation, and this text by Auguste Romieux, 1851, who was dreaming of a kind of a Bonapartism, already a Bonapartism. He's the person who apparently coined the word Caesarism. So although both were similarly pessimistic about the moral state of France, they attributed the situation to very different causes and proposed very different remedies. Constant was generally optimistic about human nature and believed in the basic goodness of the French people. To him, men were moral creatures, innately reasonable and capable of generosity and self-sacrifice. This made him even sadder that the French population had become so morally corrupt, and he placed the blame squarely on Napoleon. I'm very interested in this morality issue because I think it's been quite neglected in the scholarship. So pervading Constant's entire pamphlet is his deep outrage at the moral degradation fostered by the emperor's regime and his style of rule. Napoleon had debased and demeaned the body politic. Particularly lamentable to Constant was the astonishing greed of the French population. He said that Napoleon sets all egoism in ferment, and arbitrary power is a poison, he said. It destroys morality. Nobody dares criticize the regime. Everybody is frightened. And authoritarianism basically destroys morality. Now, Remus's text is in fact designed to encourage the soon-to-be dictator and prepare the country for the ascension of Louis Napoleon. He also finds a moral decline pervasive in France, but he believes that Bonapartism or Caesarism is going to be the correct outcome to this, the kind of cure for it. He blames liberalism for it. Liberals, he writes, don't understand the true nature of man. Their concepts have nothing to do with reality. I'm trying to shorten this, which is why I'm jumping around a little. People are by nature selfish and greedy, he writes. They're not reasonable creatures. They're moved by instinct and impressions. And the most recent revolution of 1848, during which socialism reared its ugly head, only showed that the French were now driven by instinct to rob and pillage the riches of civilization. So for Remus, the red gangrene that he called it is being spread by the people. They're jealous and hateful. They are domestic barbarians. And for this reason, they must be ruled by an iron fist. What France needs is precisely the kind of rule that Constant abhorred, the rule by a strong man. It is Louis Napoleon who should be that strong man, and he should institute a Caesarism modeled on that of his uncles and inspired by ancient Rome. When it comes to constitutional government, I've already told you what Constant believed in. So I'll skip that. He really much admired England and its form of government. He described it as a noble country, generous asylum of free thought, and the illustrious refuge of the dignity of mankind, whose superiority over the rest of Europe is attributable to its political institutions. Debate, the clash of opinions, he said, he saw in Parliament was yeah, I can't. I thought you said 20 minutes, but all right. There are many other ways that they disagree. Maybe I'll come to it later, but I thought I had 20 minutes.
You could take 2 or 3 more minutes. That's okay. We have a
all right. On warfare and military spirit, they were also very different. So Constant really castigates, very upset with the military spirit that has been fostered by Napoleon, whereas Remus advocates that, speaks very well about military power, and says that the military, and you need it to actually put down the jealous hordes, this red gangrene that now makes up the nation. To rule France, what's needed is force, not constitutions, he says. It requires something like a Praetorian Guard, he says, to guarantee order and serve as an auxiliary. So I just had a few comments on how this might be relevant today. I don't know if you want to hear it. Auguste Remus called Caesarism a special kind of rule. The word meant something different from royalty, empire, or even despotism or tyranny. A modern Caesar must know how to manipulate his people's susceptibilities, its weaknesses, its innate love of authority, and perhaps most importantly, its imagination. Reality does not work, he wrote. People are not moved by principles or arguments, but only by that which exalts and speaks to their imagination and heart. Any Caesar must use their susceptibility to impressions and spectacle to rule them. Constant called this form of rule usurpation. It was usurpation because it was the result, first of all, of an illegitimate seizure of power, A monarch ascends nobly to his throne, he wrote, while a usurper slithers onto it through mud and blood. Usurpation was also something very new. Sounding much like Remus, Constant maintained that usurpers make use of people's love of spectacle. They dazzle them, but they do so only to hide their fundamental illegitimacy. Usurpers, he writes, must constantly justify their authority, so they use lies, manipulation, and deceit to manufacture support. They form alliances with religious authorities to prop up their regimes. They take their countries into useless wars to distract people from their treachery, while they enhance their own power, line their own pockets and those of their friends. Their constant evocation of enemies and war serves to, I quote, combine and legitimize every kind of internal and external tyranny. It introduces into judicial forms a hastiness destructive both of their sanctity and their purpose. It tends to represent all men whom the agents of authority view with hostility as accomplices of the foreign enemy. It corrupts the rising generations. It divides people. One more thing. Constant adds another factor to his analysis of usurpation, which proves, if additional proof is needed, that he is the superior theorist. Dictatorships of antiquity, he notes, ruled harshly, but they left men's private lives alone. In contrast, Napoleon's style of government reached a new level of despotism because of the unprecedented extent of his intrusiveness into the private lives of individuals. Additionally, the emperor managed to mobilize support in new and insidious ways. Napoleon, Constant noted, provided, extorted, or paid for acclamation, which sounded like the national voice. A demagogue's rule depends on manipulation and deceit, and this is how he corrupts the electorate. Usurpation condemns man to speak. It pursues him into the most intimate sanctuary of his thoughts, and by forcing him to lie to his own conscience, deprives the oppressed of his last remaining consolation, thus making him complicit in his own degradation. With these words, perhaps as relevant today in the age of Trump as they were in 1814, I end these remarks.
Thank you, Helena. And now Wayne, if you could speak next.
Okay, I'm Wayne Price, and talking about Bonapartism, the state, and the question has been raised whether the state can be used in a revolutionary fashion. By the way, on the board here, I see it says Socialism in the 21st Century, which is the next, I believe, the next panel. It seems to be up on this panel. Anyway, the concept, without using the word Bonapartism, is expressed here by the great anarchist Enrico Malatesta when he wrote, "The government, though springing from the bourgeoisie and its servant and protector, tends, as with every servant and every protector, to achieve its own emancipation and to dominate whoever it protects. Thus the game of the swings, the maneuvers, the concessions and withdrawals, the attempts to find allies among the people against the conservatives, and among the conservatives against the people," from his pamphlet, Anarchy. The basic conception of Bonapartism is developed by Marx and Marxists following him, of the state in the context of and a servant of the bourgeoisie and the capitalist system, but nevertheless having its own drives institutionally by personnel for independence and domination, which it works towards by balancing off different sectors of society. I should add to Helena, if she's interested or if she hasn't already been aware of it, I don't know, in terms of the discussion of the relationship between Marx and de Tocqueville in this period, being discussed in Marx and Engels, their contribution to the democratic breakthrough by August H. Nimtz, Jr., NIMTZ. If
I don't know it.
Worth reading. The chapter anyway on this subject.
Okay. Sorry, what is it?
Marx and Engels, their contribution to the democratic breakthrough, August H. Nimtz, N-I-M-T-Z, Jr.
And it discusses Tocqueville.
And it has a chapter on the relation between Marx and Tocqueville, the different ways of approaching the events in France in that period. Let me begin by saying, what do we mean by the state? Because it's often easy to, people talk about the state, but let me be clear. By the state, we do not mean any system or institutions of decision-making, collective decision-making, or conflict resolution, or coordination, or even protection against antisocial actors or foreign aggression. Human species was doing all those things for hundreds of thousands of years before the arrival of the state. And hopefully, at the end of the state, we'll continue to do those things through various functional arrangements. By the state, what we mean, or the way I'm defining it, and what I think is consistent with the view of Marx and Engels, as well as the mainstream of anarchist analysis, I mean a bureaucratic military institution that has a socially alienated machine risen above the rest of society, instituting the defense, and by its nature must be the defense of a minority of the population. That's what I mean by the state. It should be clear that such an institution can only exist, and has only existed, to defense of a minority of the population, to hold down the majority, and to hold together a society which has various conflicts inside it. No society is more internally conflicted, perhaps, than capitalism. A society driven by competition, conflicts, hostilities, oppressions, various institutions at each other's throat, in every level, from conflicts inside the capitalist class, conflicts inside the working class, between the rich and the poor, and all sorts of non-economic conflicts, male and female, racial, national, and so forth. This is a society that needs the state. Now, to understand the relationship between the state and various kinds of societies, and whether the state can be revolutionary, it's important to see the distinction between the bourgeois democratic revolution, historically, and the upcoming, hopefully, socialist revolution, working class revolution, a revolution by the majority of the population, of the working class, and all other oppressed sections of society. And there are two main distinctions between the historical revolutions that we know of and the revolution that we hope to see, and which we have seen only glimmers of or attempts at. The first distinction is that the revolution, all previous revolutions have been ones that replaced, even though they were revolutions of masses of people, that nevertheless replaced one minority by another. In the last ones, of course, the replacement of the aristocracy by the bourgeoisie. The socialist revolution is a revolution that is a revolution of the vast majority in the interest of the vast majority. This in itself makes a difference in attitude towards the state. While a ruling minority, even if it's supported by a majority, needs the state to maintain itself in power, the socialist revolution does not, because it is a revolution of the majority against a minority. What it needs is the self-organization of the mass of people through workers' councils, workplace committees, neighborhood assemblies, various voluntary associations, democratically controlled militia of the armed population, and so forth. It needs institutions, certainly, that can deal with all kinds of conflicts and issues, including suppressing counter-revolutionary forces. But it doesn't need a state, a socially alienated machine over and above the rest of society. In fact, it cannot have such an institution. Secondly, the important difference, the working class is distinct from all other forces in the history of revolutions, and that it is a propertyless class. That is, the bourgeoisie, because the bourgeoisie's power is in its ownership of property. Therefore, it can have any kind of state, and yet nevertheless the bourgeoisie continues to rule economically and socially. There can be a ultra-democratic parliamentary system, or there can be a monarchy, an absolute monarchy, or a police state, or a military coup, or there can be fascist totalitarianism. In those situations, as is shown in the whole analysis of Bonapartism, the state is not controlled by the workers, by anybody, and particularly by the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is powerless in relation to the state, but it continues to rule over its own workers, to exploit the workers, to accumulate profits, to accumulate wealth. And in fact, if anything, its position is strengthened in the economy. Quite different is the position of the workers. Well, workers do not own 3 feet of an assembly line, or a corner of a shop floor, or so many feet inside an office. Workers work collectively, cooperatively, and without any individual property. Therefore, if the workers do not control the state, if the population doesn't really control the upper levels of the machinery, social machinery, it has no power, and it does not rule. Only the working class and its allies among all the oppressed can only rule, can only develop freedom if it is cooperative and democratic. Without democracy, there is no socialist revolution. There is no socialist society moving towards a classless society. Now that's important, and why you have to be important about analyzing how Bonapartism. Now, one of the issues I was asked was the relation between Bonapartism and the Bonapartism was used as an analysis of current society by various people, and particularly Trotsky, who applied it, I think, rather well in terms of the developments in pre-Nazi Germany and then Nazism itself, but applied it rather ill in his analysis of the Soviet Union, and not just Trotsky. That is, they tried to say, well, the Soviet Union is like, just as the bourgeoisie can be the ruling class in a society in which it does not control the state, so the workers can be regarded as ruling it. It can be called a worker state, even if whether or not that on one hand is super democratic as the early Soviets and the Paris Commune, or whether it's a bureaucratic dictatorship as under Stalinism. This is completely wrong, and misses the real point of Bonapartism in relation to the Soviet Union. Because it's just, to repeat the argument I just made, if the workers do not control the state, they control nothing. Unlike the capitalists under fascism, under Nazism, for example, when Nazism was defeated, when it was over and stripped away, there still remained the capitalists with their big corporations, with their major industries, with their exploitation of vast numbers of workers. Krupp and all the major industries continued and existed in the post-capitalist system and continue to this day. Whereas in the Soviet Union under Stalin, the workers had nothing. They were, in fact, the exploited class, the people at the bottom. The analysis, the relevance of Bonapartism to understanding part of the world today, and certainly the history of Marxism, Leninism, and Stalinism, is the point about the development tendency of the state, and particularly the executive part of the state, to rise up above the rest of society. That came to a great culmination in the Stalinist Russia. And it is a threatens today in any revolutionary attempt to use the state to change society. What happened in the Soviet Union was precisely not that the state was floating in midair, but that it rose up, it became the center of capital accumulation. And it based itself not on a bourgeoisie, because there was no bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie was destroyed, but it based itself on the continuation of the relations of production that exist under capitalism. Capitalist relations of production, which is why I think it's most accurately regarded as state capitalism or some kind of stratified capitalism. Let me finally talk about the political implications of all this. For the left, the majority of the left right now in the United States and the world believes that it's the way to liberate the world, liberate the working class and all oppressed, is through use of the state. And this is divided between the majority in the United States right now, which is reformist, hoping to use the existing state to take power in the existing state through elections and so on, and the revolutionary minority who wants to overthrow the existing state but replace it with a new state. Now, in a way, I've just been talking about the problem of replacing a state with a new state. There is no such thing as a worker state, let alone a Bonapartist worker state. On the other hand, in terms of the elections, the idea that this state, which is built as a machine to maintain capitalism, can somehow be used to change capitalism is a delusion. I find very odd to read leading intellectuals, not just new people, rank and file people, young people coming into the movement, but people calling themselves socialist intellectuals who completely ignore the lengthy and thorough history of socialists taking over states and the results. Even in our own period, we have seen the examples of Syriza in Greece, going back to Allende in Chile, or Mitterrand in France, or recently Lula's Workers' Party in Brazil, Evo Morales' recent experiences in Bolivia, what's going on in Venezuela. There tends to be two results. If the socialists should actually take power, and we think about it in terms of if Bernie Sanders and AOC were elected to run the government, the results are either, as in Syriza, or going back to Mitterrand, that the capitalists go on strike and put enough pressure on it to force them to give up their socialist goals, which happens repeatedly, or if the capitalists are worried enough, and if the government is too radical, like in Allende in Chile, they will overthrow it. They will smash the elections. They will end they will cancel elections, smash the civilian government, and replace it with some kind of dictatorship, at least for a period, until the left and the working class is so demoralized and defeated that they can risk going back to some kind of wishy-washy parliamentary democracy. The possibility of using the state, to think that from the notion of Bonapartism, that the idea that the state can become independent if the workers and population take over the state through democratic methods, that they can use it independently against the capitalists, is a fantasy. This state is an instrument of capitalism as a whole, and in itself has its own drive, not for freedom, but for greater authoritarianism and rule from above. The state is the enemy. It must be done away with, must be organized against. I'm not saying this can't make demands on it, reforms you can make demands on. After all, the workers can demand from a business management that they raise their wages or give such and such benefits. But that doesn't mean, similarly, we can demand various benefits from this state. But it's still we're outside it. We have to demand it from below. They're bringing us into the state, into the electoral system, as the democratic socialists and others demand, is a path, once again, because I say it happens again and again and again, to destruction, to co-optation, and defeat. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. And now Spencer.
Hi, everyone. I just have I want to make undertake a simple exercise in my opening statement, which is to compare two revolutionary perspectives. If you could mute Wayne, that would be great. There's a little noise coming from your end. The exercise I would undertake is to compare two revolutionary perspectives on the failure of two different revolutions. Benjamin Constant's essay, The Liberty of the Ancients Compared with That of the Moderns, which he wrote in 1816, just after the definitive defeat of Napoleon and the signing of the Treaty of Vienna, and Karl Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, written as another counter-revolution, that which culminated in Louis Napoleon's December 1851 coup d'etat, consolidated itself. In this comparison, I take up Marx specifically as, so to speak, a student of the great French politician and intellectual, and to present the 18th Brumaire as both an inheritance of and obituary for Constant's liberalism. As is well known, just after he wrote the 18th Brumaire, Marx wrote to his friend and publisher, Joseph Wedemeyer, "As to myself, no credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this class struggle. What I did that was new was to prove that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that this dictatorship only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society." For Marx, then, social classes that engage in class struggle, or the class struggle per se, had come to exist for the first time in the 19th century. That is, in the particular historical phase in the development of production that he terms capital. Incidentally, the liberal historian who most exemplified the existence of classes in modern society, or the struggle between them, or rather the recognition of the existences of classes in modern society and the struggle between them, was the one-time secretary of Saint-Simon and the close associate of Benjamin Constant, Augustin Thierry, about whose Histoire de la formation et du progrès de tiers-état, Marx in the history of the formation and progress of the Third Estate, Marx and Engels later corresponded about, and about whom Engels writes extensively in the Anti-Düring. Now to Constant. In 1816, Benjamin Constant argues against the royalists that the Ancien regime has not actually been restored. What existed in Europe before the revolution were governments which had as their strength arbitrary power, for their purpose the belittling of mankind, and which some individuals still dare to praise to us today, as if we could ever forget that we have been the witnesses and the victims of their obstinacy, of their impotence, and of their overthrow. In sweeping the Ancien regime away, the revolution had accomplished a mighty task. Constant maintains that if we take the revolution as a whole in view and concentrate our attention on its results, if we take the revolution as a whole in view, and concentrate our attention on its results, then we must deem the events of 1789 to 1815, quote, our happy revolution, unquote. So what of the revolution's vicissitudes, in which Constant himself was certainly caught up? These arose from the revolutionaries' inadequate consciousness of their historic task, as and when they constituted that task for themselves. They were politically midwiving a new form of society, but through their failure to perceive what precisely distinguished that new form of society, otherwise well-intentioned men caused infinite evils during our long and stormy revolution. This error, Constant concedes, was excusable exclaiming, "God forbid that I should reproach them," the revolutionaries, too harshly. Constant has no criticism of the revolution, only an argument about how the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. His critique is made possible by those whom he critiques. Shame on whoever does not feel the need to declare that acknowledging a few errors committed by our first guides does not mean blighting their memory or disowning the friends of mankind, unquote. Warning against complacency, against the identification of defects of character or logical shortcomings in the revolutionaries, Constant insists that the men of his own time be respectful in their criticism, and that they suspect themselves should they find themselves in agreement with the revolution's detractors. His lecture then, like Hegel in his lectures on the philosophy of history delivered 6 years later, was concerned to defend the legacy of the Enlightenment and to reconcile his listeners to the legacy of its seemingly failed but actually happy revolution. This was what liberalism meant, the late Enlightenment. And of course, the revolution had been inspired by more than anyone else by perhaps the greatest friend of mankind, one whom Constant deems the most illustrious of philosophers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the thinker with whom, more than any other, as Hegel put it, the principle of freedom dawned on the world and gave infinite strength to man. That inspiration of the Jacobins, and in that sense, the philosopher of the revolution at its height and crisis, Constant insists, was a sublime genius, animated by the purest love of liberty. And yet, the inadequacy of his thought was its failure to sufficiently specify bourgeois freedom, in consequence of which he furnished deadly pretexts for more than one kind of tyranny, unquote. Rousseau had inadequately specified modern civil liberty. Failing to grasp the spirit of the age, the revolution was rendered, the revolutionaries failing to grasp the spirit of the age, the revolution was rendered long and stormy, unquote. For Constant, modern society had given rights to the modern individual, who could not therefore be subordinated to it in the manner of pre-modern states. Rather, the state was to be subordinated to society. Gentlemen, Constant averred, we are neither Persians subjected to a despot, nor Egyptians subjected by priests, nor Gauls who can be sacrificed by their druids, nor, finally, Greeks or Romans, whose share in social authority consoled them for their private enslavement. Whatever may have been the freedom of the past, that freedom, the freedom, for instance, not to be conquered and enslaved by a rival people. Since we live in modern times, I want a liberty suited to modern times, Constant exclaims. And though his libertarian readers fail to grasp the point, Constant is clear by what he means by the spirit of the age and a liberty suited to modern times, namely the unleashing of civil or bourgeois society. The modern bourgeois, he observes, echoing Rousseau, demands the right to be subjected only to the laws. In this historically new form of society, it is the right of everyone to express their opinion, choose a profession, and practice it, to dispose of property, and even to abuse it, to come and go without permission, and without having to account for their motives or undertakings. It's everyone's right to associate with other individuals, whether to discuss their interests, to profess the religion which they and their associated prefer, or even simply to occupy their days and hours in a way which is most compatible with their inclinations or whims, unquote. Thanks to commerce, to religion, to the moral and intellectual progress of the human race, there are no longer slaves in Europe. Instead, every man is imbued with the spirit of commerce. Every man, as Adam Smith says, being a merchant, even if all he has to sell is his own labor. Consequently, Constant argues, a mass of human beings now exists that under different names, French, English, American, Dutch, are essentially homogeneous in their nature, unquote. That social homogeneity is in fact the ground of individuality. In such a society, practices are constantly being transformed, so that, for instance, morals are formed by subtle, fluctuating, and elusive nuances that cannot be fixed as invariant norms. Rather, public opinion alone can reach them. Unquote. Whether the regime of Louis XVIII recognized it or not, Constance was a commercial society, which had brought nations closer and given them customs and habits which were almost identical, so that while the heads of states may be enemies, the peoples are compatriots, unquote. The form of state such a society requires is representative. As practices change and new ones emerge, representatives can give them sanction and scope through law. Bourgeois society is not simply a scene of selfish pursuits, but the site of historical freedom. As Constant puts it, mankind possesses a noble disquiet which pursues and torments us. That desire to broaden our knowledge and develop our faculties. And political liberty expressed through representatives is the most effective means of self-development that heaven has given us, unquote. As the state is steadily rendered subordinate to society rather than ruling over it, humanity, quote, enlarges their spirit, ennobles their thoughts, and establishes among themselves a kind of intellectual equality which forms the glory and power of a people. So, for Constant, a long process of social transformation that repeatedly brought society into conflict with the state was ultimately crowned by the French Revolution, which, both despite and because of Napoleon, freed a historically new form of society. The state that emerged was likewise bourgeois, so that, quote, the despotism which was possible among the ancients is no longer possible amongst the moderns, unquote. Writing nearly half a century later, Marx entirely agreed with Constant. In the revolutionary crisis, the revolutionaries, drawing upon Rousseau and other philosophes, quote, anxiously conjured up the spirits of the past, unquote. They imagined themselves reconstituting the ancient republic rather than midwiving a new society. Just as a beginner who has learned a new language translates it back into his mother tongue. Marx follows Constant in maintaining that Camille Desmoulins, Danton, Robespierre, Saint-Just, Napoleon, the heroes as well as the parties and the masses of the old French Revolution, performed the task of their time in Roman costume and with Roman phrases, the task of unleashing and setting up bourgeois society. Not until this was done did liberalism emerge to state what, if, as Constant counseled, we concentrate on its effects, the revolution had in fact wrought. 21 years old at the time of the fall of the Bastille, none knew better than Constant that, as Marx wrote, the French Revolution stormed swiftly from success to success, its dramatic effects outdoing each other. In Constant's youth, men and things doubtless seemed, as Marx said, set in sparkling brilliance. But not until in the full powers of manhood and at the end of the revolution's career, its long and stormy career, when he delivered his famous speech at the Royal Athenaeum, could Constant digest the historical experience. By this time, as Marx says, bourgeois society in its sober reality had begotten in liberalism its true interpreters, name-checking Constant specifically. Marx's concern after 1848 was similar to Constant's after the Great French Revolution. The French liberal eschewed all anachronistic critiques of Rousseau and the French revolutionaries, seeking rather in the light of historical experience to better specify their project in order to advance the work they had begun. In this way, Constant's critique of the revolution parallels Hegel's critique of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. He appropriates them both for the new circumstances. He appropriates them both for the new circumstances that the Enlightenment and its revolution had brought about. The project for both was one of the substitution of peace for war, the pacification of the state, its total subordination to the needs of a free and dynamic civil society through the exercise of public reason and representation. Marx, too, sought the end of rule of men over men and the unleashing of the full development of the faculty of individuals in a self-regulating society. And towards that end, he too, in the face of failed revolution, sought to re-specify the project of modern revolution. But unlike Constant, he did not seek simply to further advance a modern over an ancient freedom, but to come to grips with the crisis, the self-contradiction into which modern freedom had fallen. For what enabled Constant's critique was history. And in 1848, history entered into crisis. The revolution of 1848 was not tragic yet happy, but simply farcical. For Marx, the very completion of the bourgeois revolution that brought about in the Industrial Revolution a new circumstance, what he termed capital, was the social basis of modern mass democracy. And revolution under conditions of capital undermined itself. Under Bonapartism, with democracy as its sanction, quote, what seems overthrown is no longer the monarchy, but the liberal concessions that were wrung from it by centuries of struggle, instead of society having conquered a new content for itself, as both Marx and Constant understood the Great French Revolution to have done. It seems only that the state has returned to its oldest form. Constant's argument in 1816 was that through its happy revolution, society had conquered a new content for itself, modern freedom. Of 1858 to 51, Marx maintained the same could not be said. Bourgeois society had entered into crisis, which took the political form of class struggle, that is, struggle within the Third Estate, indeed contradiction within the Third Estate, a contradiction exemplified politically by the June days of 1848. Politics had broken out of the representative form that Constant described as parties formed above all in England with the Chartists, and formed and demanded universal suffrage democracy and organized themselves in terms of class. When that politics had attempted to assert its demands in the midst of revolution in France in 1848, the result was unheard of state slaughter. And universal suffrage democracy was enlisted to contain class struggle in the regime of Louis Napoleon. The result was the reemergence of the state, not just standing, so to speak, above society, but over and against it, as Marx puts it. The rule of bureaucracy, police, and prisons had arrived. The Bonapartist state, for Marx, was not simply a deviation from the norm. It was what became of liberalism under conditions of democracy. Democracy itself being the political form of a society based on free labor, systematically generative of unemployment. Accordingly, Bonapartism for Marx was an epochal category, one that grasped the nature of the state in the days of revolutionary crisis, when the bourgeoisie could no longer rule through civil society, while the proletarianized working class could not yet rule politically. And if the working class did not rule, did not transform Bonapartism, into what Marx termed the dictatorship of the proletariat, the day that liberals look forward to, the day when no one would rule, the day of a free and self-determining society, Constant's day, indeed, of socialism would never come. Thank you.
Thank you, Spencer. And now in the order in which the opening presentations were given, we'll have a 3 to 4 minute per panelist response round, an opportunity for each of you to respond to your fellow panelists, beginning with Helena.
Beginning with Wayne. Sorry, or help me.
He's with you, Helena.
With me, yes. Okay. Well, wow. I have so much to say, as usual. So let me say a little bit something about about Wayne then. But I think I agree very much with Spencer. I have a few things to say there too, for sure, but I agree with much of what you said, Spencer. With Wayne, I just wanted, I also agreed in many ways. The liberals that I talked to were reformers, not revolutionaries. They associated anarchism with disorder and chaos. And they certainly are not for a revolution. They are gradualists, again, reformers. They are practical thinkers. Perhaps you will think that anarchism is practical, but they did not, that this could not work for various reasons. Now, also, you speak a lot about the state, and I don't know even if they had the concept of the state at that time. I think they speak more about government, and that's a different concept. And of course, they're writing about, remember, when the early, now I'm talking about the really early ones, the founders, so to speak, they are writing, their problem is absolute monarchy. And so when they fight for individual rights, this is, they're certainly not looking for worker control of the state. Somebody like Constant, remember, is living in a largely agricultural society. There are very few workers. And the workers themselves appear to be sympathetic to the liberals. 1830, the revolution, when and Constant dies in 1830, was very much a collaboration between workers and liberals. Liberals taught the workers how to organize. They manned the barricades. They were, of course, very disappointed afterwards with the July monarchy and what happened, and thus 1848. But during Constant's time, for example, the workers and the middle class, if you want to call it that, which I also think is a little anachronistic, or bourgeoisie. I also don't like that term. And also the idea that liberalism is this reflection of the bourgeois class, I think is wrong, frankly, for some of the reasons that I just said, but also because, and I'm not going to have time right now because I'm giving so little, and there's so much to say, but if you look at what happens with liberalism in the 19th century, when you have the Industrial Revolution, liberalism morphs, it changes, it evolves, and they're very much concerned with the workers. Do they want to hand over control to the workers? No, for the same reason I said in my talk. They think they're uneducated. You need capacity to vote. They're not capable of self-government. They don't have the leisure time to think about because they're so poor. And this is also at a time when, Adam Smith is just starting to be read, and then they have very little idea that society is going to, that the economy is going to move beyond the commercial society and create this worker class. They're thinking that their policies are going to lift everybody up, including the workers. This is maybe idealistic, but I just don't see them as anti-worker in any way, or necessarily you know, just for the middle class. There were liberals, of course, who were very selfish and oligarchical. You know, and there are a lot of them in the 1830s. Guizot was one. And Guizot's rule was, of course, called a financial aristocracy for reasons. But the workers loved Benjamin Constant, by the way. Huge outpouring during his funeral. And he also said very good things about them. Now, did he want to hand over control to the workers? No, certainly not. He read Godwin, by the way, and kind of disregarded him at some point. Anarchy to him just didn't make any sense whatsoever. Let me say about Spencer again. I agree with a lot of what you say. A lot. I would say though that of course Constant picks up this stage theory of the economy from the Scots, from the Enlightenment, this idea that the economy evolves over time. I would beg to differ a bit about his relationship with Rousseau. I agree with you that he thought Rousseau was a genius, and that basically the main problem with Rousseau was that he wrote in this way that got distorted or misunderstood, and in this, I can't remember the words he used, but they were unfortunate that he expressed himself the way he did. And the main thing that he takes issue with here is absolute sovereignty. This is something very dangerous. Democracy again, universal suffrage, giving power to all the people is a dangerous thing. It results in Napoleon. It results in oppression of individuals. When he speaks glowingly about the revolutionaries, I don't think he's talking about the radical Jacobins. I don't think he's talking about the Jacobins during the Terror. I think he's talking about the early phase. Correct me if you think I'm wrong. So happy revolution, yes, but it derailed into the Terror. And so he did not like this. When you talk about bourgeois freedom, there comes that word again that gets slipped in, and I'm not really sure that he has that concept. Commercial society, yes, like other liberals, he really places a lot of hope in commercial society and the progress of society, that things are going to get better. It sounds terribly naive to us today, but they really, I do think, believed that everybody was going to get lifted up. It becomes with industrialization, with the terrible condition of the working class in the cities, which becomes a little evident to most of them later rather than earlier. It's then that they become particularly sensitive to this thing they call pauperism, and they start talking about changing government, intervening to do something about the working class. Again, do they want to hand over power to the working class? No. Therefore, capacity, you have to have capacity to vote. They are incapable of self-government, but meanwhile, they don't really think anybody is capable of living in an anarchy. Again, it's chaos to them, and they are practical thinkers. Let's look at most of the people I discuss in my book are politicians. So you need to look at them also in context. They're not thinking about they're not Rousseau's, and they're not Marx. They are. Thank you. I was told to stop. I will stop.
Helena, you can finish the thought. I just wanted to signal start wrapping up.
What was I saying there? They're elected officials, and I get the same thing sometimes. Feminists will say, why didn't they? They didn't advocate rights for women, voting rights for women, and we can of course criticize them for that. But they're in Chamber of Deputies they're trying to convince people. Even Constant wanted to enlarge the electorate to men. They were talking about to suggest that women have the vote is like pie in the sky. They're going to be laughed out of Congress, out of the Chamber of Deputies. That John Stuart Mill was laughed out of Parliament. So no, they didn't do that. I hope I raised some of the questions and some of the issues brought up there. There's so much to talk about.
Thank you. Now, Wayne, go ahead.
Okay, I see I am in the middle of two experts on French liberalism. Which I am not. I do understand, however, liberalism, and I am not hostile to liberalism as such, And there's a well-known tradition of that socialism, that anarchism is of the merger, the integration of liberalism and socialism. And in fact, I wrote an essay recently on the overlapping of anarchism and John Dewey's liberalism, which I'm very interested in. But I see liberalism as developing historically out of the general capitalist society. That is, the key aspect of capitalism is that that all kinds of exceptions of standards in terms of race and birth and religion and history are irrelevant, and the only thing that counts is everybody's like an economic atom, bouncing off each other, buying and selling, all equal, with no distinctions except that of wealth. That's the core of the idea of capitalism and the abstract theory of capitalism, and becomes the theory of liberalism. As each person is equal in terms of the market, so each person should be one person, one vote, free control of election of officials, land to the peasants, land to the farmers, religious equality, et cetera, et cetera. Not that the capitalists have ever lived up to this program, but it is the bourgeois democratic program, based on the notion of the market as central to society. This itself was a step forward, of course, and I'm not denying that. Although when it comes to talking about the French Revolution, I have to say that my main sympathies are with the Hébertistes, or even more so, the Enragés, with the extreme left, and not at all really the Jacobins, who were centralizers and betrayers. I have an interesting book. I don't know if you've read The Class Struggle in the First French Republic by Daniel Guérin, who studied the rise of the early period of the Brasmus, the bear arms, the very poor, and how they organized themselves separate from and often in conflict with the Jacobins and the leading radicals inside the French Revolution. He said, he summarizes, the French Revolution was not only the cradle of bourgeois democracy, but also of communal or Soviet democracy, the democracy of workers' councils, which can be shown by the organization, self-organization of the communities, of the neighborhoods, and the communes. That's another, all right, we'll go further in that. And when talking about 1848, I think the key thing, Marx and Engels were full supporters of the bourgeois Democrats and the liberals. Marx was an editor of the leading liberal newspaper in Germany at the time, in fact. And his main criticism was he demanded that they go further, they go farther, that they fight the aristocracy, the bureaucracy, and the monarchical state. But what he came to conclude was that the capitalists could not be trusted to carry out their own liberal democratic program, mainly because they were afraid of the working class below them. They were afraid of all that you pointed out, that Helena pointed out about the chaos and so forth, their fear of the monstrous working class, the plebeians, and so forth. Therefore, when push came to shove, and finally they ended up betraying and selling out to the aristocracy, and or the development of Bonapartism. Bonapartism being selling out their democratic, liberal democratic program in favor of, as long as they can have economic power and there's a strong state that will stand in and protect them. That's the key aspect of Bonapartism, directly relies on this. Essentially, that remains. The bourgeoisie, after all, is a very conflictful ruling class, and in general, it does not like to run its own state. It generally likes to it hires professionals, even in a political democracy such as the United States. It's filled with professionals, with a somewhat exception of occasionally somebody like Trump, who is both a professional entertainer on the one hand and was a businessman on the other. But mainly, and therefore they're perfectly happy whether it's professional politicians, as we have most of the United States, or professional dictators and, ruling class Nazis and other parties that'll take over and run things for them. Of course, they prefer the democracy because of it has certain advantages for them. On the one hand, advantage of you can get rid of if you have a no good leader, you can get rid of them eventually, as we're seeing so many of them prefer right now. On the other hand, it gives the impression they can fight out their differences in non-bloody fashion, and they can give the impression to the working class population that they are free people who control their state. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. And Spencer.
Okay. Let me just glance at the notes here. I guess first to Helena. I suppose that I would respond that in an important sense, Constant, he can oppose, one or another moment or turn in history, and of course, biographically, he was involved. But it's more difficult for a liberal to say that, in some sense, history went wrong, right? History itself is what's generative of the freedom that he seeks to recognize and advance. And that's why I say that when he says we take this revolution in its results, and whatever we may disagree with, whatever contributed to the long and stormy character of the revolution, was a failing of society to recognize what it was about politically. And in that sense, I don't think that he, I think he has to recognize that Rousseau, as a thinker of, in a sense, the human self-constitution of humanity in historical time, its perfectibility, is at the core of his own thinking about history and society. I don't think he just thinks he's a genius in some kind of, oh yeah, he's very smart, but rather that he's an epochal thinker of the revolution. It's not, and just about this issue, which I think is, perhaps unfortunately generating confusion, and perhaps is a point of difference between all of us about the issue of bourgeois freedom or civil freedom, if you prefer, because it's not about the bourgeoisie. It's about the emerging society based in the urban space. It's about the third estate in that sense. It's about the freedom of the third estate. And that's what Marx means by it. Marx does not, in other words, Marx means by it what the liberals mean by it. When he says, for instance, something is a bourgeois ideology, he means it is the adequate expression of the project of emancipation undertaken to overcome feudalism and establish a society based on civil liberty. The question of pauperism, I guess what I'm trying to argue here is that, and this is why I gave the example of Augustin Thierry, who was an associate of Constance, though he had been the secretary of Saint-Simon. as someone who really despairs in 1848 because he sees that class conflict has become class struggle. In other words, the bourgeois, the revolutionaries of 1789 and to 1815 were able to enlist the people to advance the revolution. Right? What's happening in the class struggles of 1858 to 51 are not advancing society, but are ultimately leading to, as I quoted, a regression of politics to authoritarianism, and an authoritarianism that doesn't conquer a new content for society, which Marx would argue the first Napoleon did. The first Napoleon preserved the gains of the French Revolution, and as he puts it, created a world in the revolution's image in Europe. In that sense, created an environment for the revolution, a habitat, if you will, for the revolution. This is not true of Napoleon III. So that's my sort of broad, this is why he makes the distinction between history as tragedy and history as farce, the uncle and the nephew, as I understand it. To Wayne, I guess I was trying to argue, I'm arguing against the idea that the working class is plain and simple a propertyless class. It is the argument that that the Enlightenment made and that Constant is defending is a vindication of the rights of people in their persons, that we own our labor, right? As I quoted Constant to say, thankfully in Europe, we are no slaves. And so what emerges and generates the question of Bonapartism, or the problem of Bonapartism in society, is the self-contradiction of that principle of the commodity form of labor, right? That the form of freedom itself is contradictory and reposes the question of the state in a way that, for people like Constant, they thought that question was, to quote Abraham Lincoln, set in train of permanent extinction already. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you all. So beginning now the Q&A round, I would encourage our attendees to continue submitting questions through the Q&A feature. They have been stacked. And I'd like to begin with two questions that I think pose issues of continuity and change with respect to the category of Caesarism or Bonapartism across three moments: the ancient moment, the moment of Napoleon I, and the moment of Napoleon III. So I'm going to go ahead and read these, and I'll ask each of the three of you to try to address each of these two. One question comes from Terrell Carver, who writes, Marx was furious when his published 18th Brumaire was mistitled Louis Napoleon rather than Louis Bonaparte as he intended, because it played into the would-be usurper, later elected president's delusional, quote-unquote, Napoleonic fantasies. And the second question comes from Richard Rubin. The term Caesarism raises the question of the relationship between the modern state and the pre-modern state. Is there a fundamental analogy or a fundamental discontinuity between modern bourgeois and pre-modern political forms? So beginning with Helena, if you could each address each of those two questions.
Oh, I didn't really hear a question in the first one, but I'm happy to talk about there's differences between Julius Caesar, the Roman idea of citizenship, and the later 19th century understanding of Caesarism, again, you know, they take the person and there was no Caesarism under Caesar. I mean, I'm a strict, again, this is if you strictly take a conceptual approach, and we can discuss whether that's right or not. I understand the problems with it. Do you have a concept before you have the word, for example? I like to play around with that question. But in Roman times, you know, dictatorship was a legitimate form of rule. It was when the state, if you want, was in trouble. You had a dictator who would come, but he would be and take all authority, but he was supposed to rule only for a certain amount of time. And this was, and you find this role of the dictator all throughout history. In fact, you find it in Rousseau as well, right? There's a section where he has this idea of the dictator. Now, when we get to Caesarism, it's kind of forever. I mean, there's going to be even a successor. It becomes a kind of a permanent form of rule. So that's what I would say there. I'm not 100% sure I'm answering the question, but a historical evolution of the idea of Caesarian type of rule. On the second one, sorry, what was that? Remind me.
Terrell Carver is recapitulating Marx, the idea that it was delusional for Napoleon III to claim a fundamental continuity with Napoleon I. And would you share Marx's assessment?
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I mean, I think it's that's why he was made fun of so much. It was delusional. Society had changed in all sorts of ways, and the economy. Did I say the economy? The problems, you'd had 1848, you'd had socialism really rear its ugly head, according to them. You had the Red Menace. So yes, it was quite absurd, but it seemed to work for a while. The whole idea of a charismatic leader who was going to come and take care of a hero, who was going to take care of everything and unite the country and do great things and establish order, and is somehow related to the revolution, the first major revolution, also helped the revolution on horseback. So yes, I think that was absurd.
Wayne, if you could address these questions.
Oops, I can't hear.
Wayne, you are muted. There you go.
Now I am unmuted. Nothing to say about the first question about how angry Marx was about being on the question of Napoleon. It's true, he regarded Napoleon III as a fraudulent, somebody really shared nothing with his uncle, but in terms of talents, nothing but the name. And Marx believed that. On the question of Caesarism, it's interesting that in the preface to the second edition, he specifically criticized the use of the term Caesarism as applying to, as an historical analogy to Napoleon, particularly because in ancient Rome, the class struggle took place only within a privileged minority between the free rich and the free poor, unlike the current situation in France at the time. However, Karl Draper, in his history of Marx's theory of revolution and Marxist politics, does go into Caesarism and the comparison both of Caesarism as well as even the historical, the rise of the monarchies at the end of feudalism, to say there's a general tendency throughout history when societies start to fall apart for there to rise up a central authoritarian regime of some sort, a state structure. And in that sense, Caesarism is relevant here, even though, of course, the difference between ancient Rome and a capitalist, early capitalist France is quite different in many ways. But in that sense, the rising up of the state, of an individual, the stand is for the state, to balance off society and to stand up and hold things together is a consistent pattern throughout history, as it was throughout, even in his own time. Engels referring to Bismarck as an example of Bonapartism. In fact, Engels summarized, he said, as far as he could see, that Bonapartism was the religion of the bourgeoisie, meaning they really can't run things by themselves, was his general assumption there. I did want to just make a brief comment on the last comment by Spencer. When I referred to the working class as propertyless, I, of course, was not denying property in the sense of themselves, their ability, particularly the function of labor, which becomes sold on the market as labor power, the commodity labor power. The point is that's all they have, an aspect of themselves, without owning. Now, of course, there are people who have tools and so on, but mostly they don't have tools, they don't have land, they don't have part of productivity. All that, the main areas of capital and land and so forth are in the hands of a minority, whom they have to go sell their ability to labor in order to exist. Next.
Sorry, just taking a note here. Yeah, so first of all, the Bonapartism Helena is right. It's not a term coined by Marx. In fact, I would argue that part of Marx's liberalism, or if you wish, his Hegelianism, is that he never coins any terms, ever. And he doesn't coin dictatorship of the proletariat. He doesn't coin from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. He doesn't coin much of anything. He takes up the language of his time and critically appropriates it. Bonapartism is a term that, like liberalism, was thrown around with the ism as early as the 1830s. So about the question of continuity between pre-modern and modern political forms, particularly as regards Caesarism, and particularly the question of dictatorship, and also the issue of the permanence of Bonapartist dictatorship. While it is true that Napoleon adopted himself, and I mean Napoleon the Great, adopted himself the trappings of Caesar, the title, and he portrayed himself as a Caesar in many ways. There was a bourgeois defense of his rule, which is that he represented the prerogative of the state executive to preserve society, and in particular, in this case, to preserve the revolution. That would have been Napoleon's, so to speak, bourgeois self-defense. And that would go straight back to arguments by John Locke about the prerogative of the executive. Napoleon III also claimed to be preserving the revolution. And indeed, Marx refers to his policy as imperial socialism repeatedly. And Helena referred to some of the reasons why that was, like his fixing of the price of bread, the soup kitchens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that much of his finance policy, of his financial policy of the Crédit Mobilier was instituted by Saint-Simonians. And of course, this dates back to his own writings on the Napoleonic ideals before he seized power. Which drew in a very kind of eclectic way from the socialism of his day. So about the issue of Bonapartism and its permanence and dictatorship, the dictatorship of Bonaparte, of Louis Napoleon, I should say, to honor the spirit of Terrell's question, is part of its problem. It's not really preserving society, it's giving up the freedom of society in order to, in a sense, manage a state of emergency. It is that state of emergency is the result of the self-contradiction of the principle of the commodity form of labor, or what Marx calls the contradiction of bourgeois right, which is announced in class struggle itself, that there are opposing property rights underlying society, with the rise of socialism, or opposing property rights being asserted in society with the rise of socialism in the Hungary 40s especially, and the organization of politics itself on that basis, as I said, with the Chartists and socialists in Europe. So the issue becomes one of the necessity of dictatorship to manage that crisis. And so for Marx, and this gets to the issues that, that Wayne raised about anarchism and the perennial debate between Marxists and anarchists, the necessity of a transitional state called the dictatorship of the proletariat. The reason for the necessity of that is because of the persistence of the social crisis condition that gave rise to Bonapartism in the first place, namely the crisis of capital, the crisis of bourgeois society under conditions of capital, under conditions of industrial revolution with endemic unemployment, where ultimately, in a sense, the freedom of the working class is in contradiction with itself.
So Spencer, I think your remarks just now effectively anticipated and addressed a question that was posed by William Lushbaugh. What was it about capitalism that caused society to turn from liberalism to authoritarian or statist politics? In other words, Bonapartist politics. So I'm wondering, to bring Helena and Wayne back into the conversation, would either of you like to address that question? What was it about capitalism that caused society to turn from liberalism to authoritarian or statist Bonapartist politics? How would you conceive of that?
I understand the question very well, and why this person posed it, and in a certain way of thinking, it makes a lot of sense. But the way I look at liberalism, I don't see it being supplanted by Bonapartism or authoritarianism. Liberalism continues. Liberalism evolves the whole time. It doesn't give way, or so did you say capitalism doesn't give way to something else? So, but if you want to know what I think about how in France Bonapartism came to exist because of economic situation, that I can answer. And the sense that liberals in power were not responding to the working class. You have the rise of socialism, and they get, so until then, I would say that liberals and the left were kind of on the same side. I said before that workers supported the liberals in the revolution of 1830, hoping that the liberals were going to establish better salaries and factory conditions and so on, and they were sorely disappointed by the July monarchy, and also very disappointed, many were, that the electorate, the franchise was so restricted. So, and then there is, of course, economic distress and disorder. There's this disorder. And the revolution of 1848, which is terrifying to liberals in power and to most liberals. This is when they start talking about having full force to, about workers' right to work, and about, you have Louis Blanc in Parliament, in the Chamber of Deputies. You have these socialist newspapers coming out. You have Proudhon as works proliferating. And so you have the liberals in power, conservative liberals, very, very worried, and they turn to Louis Napoleon basically as some kind of savior that is going to reestablish order, stop socialism, protect property. So that's how I see his rise coming about, basically. I'm sure I left something out, but those are the main contours. This is the main thing I would explain. So history is complicated, you know. There's a lot of factors to revolutions. There's a lot of factors to the rise of a despot like Louis Napoleon. He had a lot of support from liberals, frankly, who were terrified by the revolution.
I would say, am I on?
Yes.
Excuse me. What caused the rise of Bonapartism, Bonaparte's dictatorship? And why do we see these kind of things repeated? When the system is in crisis, the point of the state is to hold things together, especially under capitalism, and to maintain a system that the bourgeoisie cannot do for themselves, and let them settle their disputes and put someone in charge and try things out. But when the system gets to be really crisisful, when things really fall apart, that's when they turn towards more and more authoritarian regime. We can see this right now, where in a legitimate crisis, people say, well, we need more of an authoritarian regime. We need more authority. We need, at the very least, a competent president. Now, that's true for a certain time-limited specific crisis. With the example of Cincinnatus or George Washington going home to his farm, that after, in a specific crisis, you could put, you know, things in the hands of a particular, some kind of centralized situation to deal with the immediate crisis. The problem is when the crisis is continuous and overwhelming, then everybody turns towards certainly the capitalist class turns to a real authority figure that'll keep things going for them. And as Helena says, beat down the dogs and drive them back to their kennels, and carry out whatever reforms are necessary, even against the wishes of that section of the bourgeoisie that doesn't see the need for sacrifice, particularly the weaker sections of the bourgeoisie, doesn't want to sacrifice themselves for the good of the richer part of the big monopolists. And of course, there's a tendency among working people to look for authority, for a father who'll solve things for us, will take care of things for us. We all are raised in this society, and that gets into social psychology, the kind of capitalism and kind of society we have, to look for an authority figure that'll take care of us. This doesn't mean, however, I don't conclude with Spencer that this somehow supports the idea of a transitional state of a revolution, because what the workers need is not to have their own authoritarian, centralized dictatorship, but precisely to oppose that, something to mobilize the masses of people to take care of things for themselves. That means organization, yes. It does mean mass self-organization. It does mean federation and association of various councils and committees and mass organizations. Absolutely. But it doesn't mean a need for a new authority figure to handle us. A dictatorship of the proletariat, whatever Marx meant by that, but certainly not dictatorship proletariat as has been interpreted ever since Leninism.
Thank you, Wayne. I think when I look at the questions we have on Stack, I think there's a desire to move our conversation into the late 19th and 20th century, including up to the present. So I think if we proceed chronologically, one question that might come next is from Danny Jacobs. How does progressivism relate to Bonapartism? And he goes on to ask, even leftists who consider themselves critical of progressives still consider progressives to the left of conservatives. but has the left not become the biggest proponent of Bonapartism? What does that mean for reconsideration of this history, including the fact that this history of progressive support for Bonapartism is often ignored or treated superficially by the left? And whoever would like to go first in addressing that, please go ahead.
I'm always going ahead, so maybe I should let somebody else go first. I'm sure Wayne has something to say.
Well, as I said, the left is dominated by statism, authoritarianism, all aspects of the left. That doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong to call for reforms or help for the. I'm not against as demanding that the government right now provide funds for unemployed people or expand healthcare coverage. But the overall perspective of the left has been calling on the government to do more and more. So absolutely, you're right. And up to a certain point, it makes sense. But actually, it tends to lead towards saying the government is the prompt solution. Let the government take care of it. Let's not organize ourselves. Let's not form cooperatives. Let's not act on our own. And then it means the way to get the government to do things is to support some political party that'll operate within the limits of electoralism and that elects somebody else to go to a distant city to be political for us and take care of us instead of ourselves organizing ourselves to take care of us. The government is not competent. It's not just that Trump, for example, is an idiot and a vile human being, but even the most competent person in the world, for one person to be leading and organizing, what is it now, 320 million people, is absurd. It's much too big. Perhaps that's part of the reason that, at least one of the reasons why South Korea, a teeny little country, could do so much better than the United States. It's too large. And I think that the progressives are trying to accept this growth of monopoly capitalism, the growth of the state, and they just want to tinker with it and file down the edges of the chains that we have to wear. Want to try now, Helena?
Sure. Well, I disagree completely. I don't think that the left, the progressives, are anything like the authoritarian regimes of Bonapartism. I think if you look at, I mean, like somebody like Bernie Sanders, let's talk about, yeah, they want a bigger state. They want the state to intervene. But as you're talking about social democracy, I mean, certainly Napoleon, it was a sham, his Napoleon III, a sham of representation. And I don't think the left in America is anywhere near that. I mean, they're Democrats. They believe in individual rights. They believe in, individual rights. And the representative proper, true elections compared to their, the Republicans, for example. Now, I would say that there's a certain style that's going, like Bernie Sanders in particular, has a certain style, or you might call it populist style, in the way he the way he has rallies and the way he appeals, and also the way we talk, we have an enemy, it's Wall Street, it's the 1%. So you create an enemy and then you appeal directly to the people. Washington is corrupt. I know you, I understand you, he says to the crowd. So that's is a kind of style. We get again, like you, with all due respect, Wayne, you keep talking about this thing called the state, and I just don't see it the way you do. And by the way, I think that the left, the progressives, are doing too little for people. What economic, socioeconomic changes? What big government? I mean, it's been a lot about status rights recently, about things that are important, but rights of gender and all sorts of status rights that are on top of my head now. I'm not going, instead of real changes to the socioeconomic system where the government steps in. Here, maybe Bernie Sanders is the exception to the rule, but really Clinton and Biden, who would call themselves progressive in many ways, are not for a big government, in my opinion. They're not for an authoritarian state.
Shall I? I think the question refers to the American political phenomenon known as progressivism, or that's the way Ed took it. And I don't really want to get into that in particular, but simply to say a couple of points to kind of frame that, which is that we in our reading group like a quotation by the fairly mainstream commentator Louis Menand, who says of Marx and Engels, they were philosophers of a second enlightenment. And by philosophe of a second enlightenment, he means that there was a necessity for the recognition of new circumstances, that the first enlightenment, which of course had many generations and phases, going back at least into the late 17th century and on into liberalism in the early 19th century, that circumstances had sufficiently changed as to require not just a continuation of that project, but a recognition of those new circumstances. And what that recognition consisted of is that precisely the project of the Enlightenment in its completion was giving rise to a new type of problem, not just the, in a sense, substitution of freedom in place of arbitrary power or despotism, but rather that the freedom in question was self-contradictory, right? That, and in that sense, Marx does not believe, though of course, as a, so to speak, empirical historical fact, liberalism carries on, and people claiming the heritage of liberalism continue to exist. Marx would insist vehemently, as indeed would the entire socialist tradition in an important way, that it is the heir of liberalism. And as he puts it, liberalism is vulgar. After 1848, he calls it liberalismus vulgaris. He refers to vulgar political economy. He talks about how John Stuart Mill can't repeat his father's writings word for word. He's incapable of, in a sense, the scientific attitude towards society characteristic of the great bourgeois thinkers. And that is combined with, of course, this question of mass democracy, which is where I would begin to frame the issue of progressivism in the United States. The rise of vast party political machines, which are unknown, substantially unknown. You could talk about precursors with, say, the Jacksonian Democratic Party in the United States, but substantial transformation has taken place before and after 1848 in the practice of politics, and in particular with the rise of the political party order. And I think that there you see within the history of socialism, of course, an attraction to statism, an attraction to getting policies in place from the state, rather than organizing within civil society. And so I don't want to sort of go into that in too great a detail, except to say that there is a history of socialism grappling with those questions, right? What does it mean to have a party that seeks to institute socialism, right? which is to say not something that we want or don't want, but something that is necessitated in the age of democracy, in the age of political parties, right? If we don't have a party for socialism, we're going to have another party project managing managing society through the state, like, the great, machines of the Democratic Party in the late 19th century. So I'll just leave my comments at that. But just to say that there is a question of mass democracy that socialism is coming to deal with after the revolution of 1848. And I'll just add one last point, which is just to underscore or make clear and explicit the implication of what I was saying before, which is that for Marx, Bonapartism is a characterization of the politics of an epoch of history. It's not about authoritarian regimes or non-authoritarian regimes. He talks about the Liberal Party in England as Bonapartist, the party of Palmerston and Gladstone as Bonapartist. He talks of parliamentary Bonapartism. He certainly thinks that, and this is a huge question, that the American crisis after the Mexican War and the crisis of the party of the political order and the breakdown of the Democratic Party and ultimately civil war cannot be understood in liberal terms, that this is a phenomenon of the era of Bonapartism. So Marx is an epochal theorist of an age of politics and then of socialism within that, rather than just asserting one class against another class in a kind of a perennial struggle.
May I just add one thing that I wanted to make sure to get out there to say today, which I might not have said before, and that is, and it responds to a couple of questions that have come up in our discussion. Liberalism is not one thing, right? There's been arguments about it the whole time. There have been there was in the 19th century people who called themselves socialist liberals, liberal socialists, and they argued with other liberals. There was a constant discussion about what is true liberalism. There was something called progressive liberalism. There was something called reformist liberalism. I hate to say this, but it's complicated. And they criticized each other, right? For being for a financial aristocracy. This was conversation going on among liberals. And today, what we haven't talked about are the libertarians. The right libertarians who claim to be the true liberals. I know many of them. I've been asked to give talks, and a couple of them are my friends. It's fun to talk to them, but they think that they are the true liberals, and they want to reclaim the word. So you have liberals like Bernie Sanders or whatever, Elizabeth Warren, and you have liberals like Rand Paul. I don't know if he wants to call himself a liberal, actually. Dan Klein, I would say, who's a big advocate of this, and George Mason Institute and these places, Adam Smith Institutes around the country, who claim that the classical liberals, they speak about something called classical liberalism, and they claim they are the true liberals.
So we have a number of questions that address the application of the term or concept of Bonapartism to 20th century political phenomena. So Lucy asks, we have had a debate within Platypus. Some members feel the term Bonapartism is used too widely and does not help to specify different stages of capitalism we have experienced or different forms of state we have seen in the 20th or into the 21st century, from fascism to Stalinism to the New Deal to our present states across the world today. So does Bonapartism as a term help to clarify, or does it obscure our understanding of different state forms we have seen post 1848? That's a question to all panelists. And then somewhat similarly in that vein, Richard Rubin asks specifically to Spencer, do you agree with Wayne Price that Trotsky was wrong in applying the category of Bonapartism to Stalinism? What are the political stakes of this? And Will Stratford also raises the question of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Should he be seen as a Bonapartist figure in American history? So again, all of you can feel free to address that question, that kind of series of questions as you see fit.
Somebody else want to go first? I would say, I'm sorry, Wayne, did you want to go first? Go ahead. No. Yeah, so I would just say that we got to be careful with terms and make sure we define them. And I'm, as I think you gather, interested in precisely how words and names like Bonapartism are used, whether it's still a good word to use. I would say, yeah, if you define it, if you say what you mean by that, and that when you're arguing about it with somebody else, that you're both using the same definition. That's what I would say. It's a little bit wrong, a little bit anachronistic, but this word isn't going to go away. It's a powerful word, and I imagine that it's going to be here for a long time and argued about. Actually, when you're going to have pain in the neck people like me saying, well, that's not what I meant.
I'm curious, Helena, just to follow up on that, because you'd mentioned the figure of Bernie Sanders, who often consciously and otherwise evokes the figure of FDR. Where, in your understanding, where would you situate a figure like FDR in relation to the phenomenon of Bonapartism?
No, I would not use the word Bonapartist. I'm not a great expert on FDR, but I wouldn't use that label for him. I might use the word Caesar. Might say Caesarism about Lincoln. You know, Lincoln was called a kind of a Caesarist in his form of, when he took over so much power. But this was his enemies. His enemies said that about him. And didn't the person who killed him say something I've killed Caesar or something like this? So people were upset that he had taken over such so much power as he had, and I'm sure Wayne will have something to say about how the state grew thanks to Lincoln. But FDR, it depends what you mean by Bonapartist, but I wouldn't use that term. No, I'm constantly interested in like what did people at the time call him, and so no, I wouldn't use that term.
It's hard to know where to begin, but just to pick up on that issue of is Lincoln a Bonapartist? I think it gets to the issue of what it means to call the Soviet Union under Stalin Bonapartist, in the sense that Marx wouldn't have called Lincoln a Bonapartist, because he does reserve the term as a kind of term of political obloquy or opprobrium. But he's perfectly aware that Lincoln cannot govern as a liberal and cannot conduct war, even in the way that Napoleon the Great conducted war, but must conduct war against the population of the South, and must suspend all manner of rights in the North. If you're saying something, Wayne, you're muted.
The white population of the South.
Right. He makes war against the white population of the South in episodes like the burning of Atlanta that exemplify that. And of course, he knows that this is beyond anything that had ever been seen in war, as did the European military observers of the Civil War. And so what you might say is that Lincoln is a critical Bonapartist or a revolutionary Bonapartist. He is a stage in the development, potentially, of a second American Revolution. Well, he is a stage in the development of a second American Revolution, which remains incomplete. And so for Marxists, it's not just, in a sense, Stalin who is the Bonapartist. It is any revolutionary. Anyone who's actually trying to manage capitalism politically. So that would apply, for instance, to Lenin. It's simply not used because Lenin would be viewed as a revolutionary, as, in a sense, an authentic attempt to advance the political problem in question. And it would be no more valuable to term him a Bonapartist or a critical Bonapartist than terming Abraham Lincoln a critical Bonapartist. But in both cases, they're managing a situation that expresses the full-blown crisis of liberalism, whether that be the slaveholders' revolt of 1861 or the mass slaughter of the imperialist powers in World War I. So I guess that, I would say that, and of course here I strongly disagree. I would say about to Helena, Marx knows that it's complicated.
Yes, of course. He's brilliant.
He knows just how complicated it is. And he, of course, is making an argument about what liberalism is, or what he calls bourgeois ideology. Which is something that he analyzes stretching over about a century and a half, from the late 17th century to roughly the 1820s and 30s.
I'm sorry, but so how are you disagreeing with me?
What I'm saying is that the disagreement that Marx would have, that Marx and Marxism would have, is that the same project continues.
No, I understand, but what I was, so I'm sorry again to interrupt, but you are making very clear that you're using Marx's view of Bonapartism, and that's what I answered before, saying if you make clear whose definition you are using and then apply it, then it's clear what you are doing.
The definition of Bonapartism that Marx uses in some sense is no different than the liberals. What you laid out in terms of political manipulation, militarism, standing police, prisons, a form of demagogy in politics, buying off the press, the subversion of the press, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If Marx is condemning Bonapartism, he's going to condemn it in liberal terms, because only liberalism condemns Bonapartism. It's condemnable as illiberal. The point that Marx would make is that that's also true of all regimes, even without the great leader or the dictator, that you get Bonapartist politics mediated by competitive party politics. You get Bonapartist politics mediated through parliamentarism, et cetera, because the state is coming to do things that Benjamin Constant would be horrified by. And that's where I don't understand why you're resistant to treating, for instance, Democrats as Bonapartist politicians, because they cannot acknowledge the kind of freedom that Benjamin Constant, in a sense, insists upon. And he does insist upon it economically as well as in every other way. The right to dispose of your property, or as he puts it in the speech, the liberty of the ancients and moderns compared, to abuse your property. Not only to use it, but to abuse it.
He also says that it's a social convention.
It is a social convention, but you can't say that he would argue for the systematic intervention of the state in the economy. You cannot. Or that any liberal could, without, in a sense, recognizing, so that whole idea of, that the spectrum of liberalism is defined by how people think about intervening in the economy with the state. For Marx, is a narrowing of liberalism's aspirations, which were really about the historical flourishing of the faculties of man in history. the full flourishing of society in that respect, and ultimately the elimination of coercion by the state, of the necessity of a standing institution for coercion. That's where I would say liberalism is the father of all socialisms. That when Wayne says, anarchism is a kind of marriage of liberalism with socialism, I would say that liberalism is just simply the father of socialism. It's the project of liberalism continued under changed conditions. It's the project of societyism, right? Of statelessness, of the self-regulation of people, and the substitution of morals and law for coercion.
I wouldn't disagree with at least most of what you just said there. I think you're absolutely right.
Wayne, you have to unmute.
I'm sorry. I agree that we have to be careful about terms, because it's really not the term that matters so much as the concept. Certainly in the question of Bonapartism, the key thing about Bonapartism, the key lesson to be learned from 1851 and onward, is the tendency of the state to rise above society, to become relatively independent or autonomous, especially the rise of the executive. I think there's simply no question. If you look at the United States and its history, the rise of the state, and particularly the executive, to become semi-autonomous. This is something that the liberals used to cheer when they were writing histories of the New Deal. They wrote about the imperial presidency, but then when the right wing took over and continued to expand the executive powers of the executive, they suddenly became very hostile to that. Many liberals. And certainly today we see, even today, the use of the rise of the independence of the executive in one of the big issues of the impeachment and ongoing politics in the United States, with the declaration that the executive can do whatever damn it wants and ignore even subpoenas or other things from the legislative branch of the government. This is a general trend, and well, the same point, that's the key issue here, rather than, do you call it Bonapartist, is it Bonapartist? Certain things are Bonapartistic, Bonapartist-like. Was Nazism Bonapartist? Well, it seemed to go beyond, certainly went far beyond what Napoleon, the Little, ever achieved. Does it apply to the Soviet Union and so forth? The key issue is the growth of the state. And the support. Now, again, liberals is also a term that's been, meant everything from, they used to define any definition of every position all the way around Robin Hood's barn. If by liberals today you mean, and John Dewey, for example, is very clear about how he disagreed with what liberalism had come to mean in his time as an excuse for support for unfettered capitalism, like the libertarians today, so-called the right-wing libertarians, who are against the bureaucratic centralized state, but they're all for bureaucratic centralized corporations. That they don't mind. If by the liberals you mean something like, as I think Helena referred to as, or progressives, Biden, certainly the authoritarianism that I raised before is very clear in that case. After all, Biden was one of the major organizers of the expanded powers of the anti-crime bill that was passed under Clinton, and all these people were supporters of the Homeland Security Act and all these things, about anything they pushed for these kind of things. And it goes further on to the left, the far left. If by liberals you mean the people who are sympathetic to so-called democratic socialism, you'll find large numbers of them are sympathetic to Cuba. In fact, look at the little reference to by by Bernie about Cuba, how nice it was they had mass education, which was true. But why was he raising it? It's sort of like saying that Mussolini got the trains run on time. It only serves to justify and support authoritarian regimes. Supporters of the Maduro regime and so forth. The authoritarianism and in terms of domestic policies. One of the major things on the left, after all, is the push for, they'd like to disarm the American population. Opposition to any kind of gun ownership. Basic rights that it's an authoritarian position. It's a pro-state in which they want nothing but the only people to have guns should be the police and the criminals, and they're against ordinary people having weapons. Well, the demand on the left for a militia, for an armed people, goes way back, and it's always been a demand, even in fact from liberalism to today. I picked this just as one example.
Wayne, could I just pick up on something that you're talking about here?
Absolutely.
Which is that it's important to recognize, at least in the developed socialist tradition, that when you're talking about Bonapartism, you're not talking about, you're not talking about the regime of the leader. You're talking about the state. You're talking about its military and its bureaucracy. Right. And that in a fundamental way, for instance, Louis Napoleon was a tool of the French military and the French bureaucracy. And it's the French military and bureaucracy which continue into the Third Republic. And in that sense, the Bonapartism of the regime does not end. And that's where I would begin to address the issue of talking about Trump. Trump is also being opposed by the state. And one of the remarkable things about his time in office, his first term, is how nakedly obvious that has been shown to be true. That not only did the FBI investigate a politician's and political parties run for office, which is a scandal. That is, obviously portends all sorts of things for not only right-wing politics, for all politics. And it's also very clear that what he calls the deep state, which is to say the military and the CIA, hate his policies, especially as regards the Middle East and Russia. And it's that question that I think Wayne is beginning to talk about when he talks about the state standing over and against society, right? That it's not simply about demagogues. It's really about the form that the state takes and how politics mediates it in the age of capital. So yeah, I would just
I wanted also. Oh, sorry. If you want to directly respond to that, it's better.
No, you go.
I wanted to just say something about, Wayne, your use of the word authoritarian disturbs me a little bit, because here we go in when a term is used so much that it loses meaning. I mean, if Biden is authoritarian, what do we do with Putin?
Some are more authoritarian than others.
Okay. All right.
These are all supporters of the state, and they all are repressive in various ways. But obviously, there are differences. Clearly, we live today under a bourgeois democracy, representative democracy, which is much better than living under fascist totalitarianism or Stalinist totalitarianism. And I wouldn't deny that for a second. And I wouldn't, in fact, defend what democratic rights we have against the repression. But that doesn't change on the same time that this is, in fact, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. That is, a minority of the population, the famous, what's been referred to as the 1%, more or less, controls the society overall, gets the wealth overall, gets the lion's share of the wealth that everybody participates in making, and makes overall decisions that affect the whole of society. And all of the politicians are for that. The Democratic Party is all for it. And all the liberals are for maintaining it. I mean, my liberals even going as far as not just Nancy Pelosi, but even Bernie Sanders, after all. What is his program? Something like the Nordic countries, which are, after all, capitalist countries with lots of social welfare, which is under attack right now, but nevertheless. They're all for a situation where a minority gets the wealth and rules society in that sense. So that's what I mean by saying, you know, it's essentially, they're all authoritarian, but some are more so than others. Just let me finally say something. Spencer's comments about the how even Lenin was a.
And just to add to that, you know,
yes.
Obviously Biden, Bernie, and Trump are all contending to administer, you know, a vast police state.
That's right. They're all aiming to be who can best run the most powerful imperial capitalist state in the world, and overall oversee the capitalist economy. And frankly, I am not very sympathetic to this as a goal. That's different from the question whether any individual who you should vote for or whatnot. Essentially, this is evil.
I mean, if I could interrupt you,
yes,
I'm being reminded that we should be wrapping up pretty soon. Okay. And there are a few questions on the table that I think might pose well your closing remarks of maybe 2 to 3 minutes each. The questions are effectively about Sanders, Trump, and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Each of those topics has already been covered to some extent. So I'll just pose these questions and suggest that each of you maybe address them in some way in your concluding remarks. Pam Nogales asks specifically to Helena, what is liberalism today? How does it stand in regard to the labor problem? Why do today's socialists, quote unquote, such as Bernie Sanders, remain liberals? Rana Urek also asks to Helena, but each of you could potentially address this. You ended your talk with Bonapartism in the age of Trump. Do you see a meaningful connection between Constant's moral remarks and the contemporary critiques of Trump that one hears? And then Lou Sterrett asks, how does the speaker's understanding of the dictatorship of the proletariat with regard to Bonapartism? How do you envision that connection between the dictatorship of the proletariat and Bonapartism? So if you could each take a few minutes and give some closing remarks and try in some way to address each of those 3 questions, Sanders, Trump, and the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Did you want me to go first?
Sure, that would be great.
Oops, I don't remember the first one. Sanders and Trump.
Why do today's socialists, such as Bernie Sanders, remain liberals? What is liberalism today?
Oh, you see, I'm not so sure. I think this word liberal today is, a lot of people shy away from it. I don't know how many, if Bernie Sanders really calls himself that. There's a huge, within the Democratic Party, some people call them all liberal. There's a mess with the way we use this word, because it's some people use it precisely to just refer to all Democrats. Some people use it to just refer maybe to Biden. Biden wouldn't touch the word because he thinks it's going to make him unelectable. Ever since Ronald Reagan talked about the dreaded L word, I think most Democrats have kind of shied away from it. And so, oops, I forgot the bit about Trump. I don't know, I must be getting tired. But anyway, I'll answer another one in the meantime. Early liberals would not be surprised by the Trump phenomenon. They would not be surprised by this the trend towards illiberal democracy. This is some people find those 2 things, illiberalism and democracy, contradictory in some way, and that they don't go together. But liberal democracy is not, liberalism and democracy, as I tried to say in my talk, don't easily fit together. liberals were worried about democracy for most time. It wasn't liberals that pushed through universal suffrage. I think socialists did it more than liberals. So the phenomenon of Trump, populism around the world, would not surprise my guys, my liberals. Did I sort of answer the questions?
And what about the dictatorship of the proletariat? How do you understand it in relation to Bonapartism?
To Bonapartism, I don't see that there's any relationship. I mean, I understand. No, I shouldn't say that. I'm not an expert on Marx. I learned a lot today. And you convinced me that I need to, if I needed convincing, I'm going to look more closely at Marx for sure. But so, as a historian and a historian of concepts, I would want to go and see, what does Marx say? What does Marx say about Bonapartism and dictatorship of the proletariat? And then I'd like to talk about that, as opposed to, do I, in 2019, think that there's a connection? I would say that Helena Rosenblatt, personally, I don't, but maybe Marx did, maybe other people did. And I find that extremely interesting. I love this fact that this is an interdisciplinary panel. I mean, Wayne is here, and I find him as more of a philosopher, more as an advocate, and I'm very much a historian. It's wonderful when we can talk to each other and understand. Spencer's more of a historian who has also some philosophical side to him, I think, or if I'm mistaken, and I am quite the historian. I do have some personal political beliefs, of course, and those always kind of, you can't help but have them come in, but I don't know if you all agree with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. And Wayne, go ahead. Closing remarks.
Oh.
Unmute Wayne.
There, I keep on doing that to drown out the sounds of my grandson in the background. Let me start at the end. The dictatorship of the proletariat is a term Marx used, and there's a volume of the on a book, on a volume by Hal Draper that goes through, it looked up every single time that Marx or Engels used the term. There were about 12 times. And he comes to the conclusion that what Marx essentially meant by this was neither more nor less than the rule of the working class. Not even a particular type of rule, not a particularly despotic type of rule, but it's a general statement for the rule of the working class. And if anything, it meant it was democratic because it was counterposed to the idea of a rule of a specific party that was being raised by the Blanquists, who wanted to rule their party to become the dictatorship. And they were saying, no, we want the working class as a whole, along with its allies and other classes, to run society, as opposed to the capitalists. And therefore, it has no connection whatsoever to the discussion of Bonapartism. I'm not sure I understand the concept being raised about Bonapartism, in that Bonapartism comes up when there's a crisis, when there's difficulty, and it's a long-term tendency of capitalism, and a way of dealing with it that is not necessarily Bonapartism. Let's say the state, the development of the regular autonomy and autonomization, development, independence of the state. To refer to Lenin as a Bonapartist can only be used in a negative sense. He was, after all, what we are for is not the managing of capitalism, but the ending of capitalism, the replacement of capitalism. And this can't be done by a minority with a bureaucratic military institution under them. It can only be done by the organized working class and its allies, peasants and all oppressed people. And therefore, it's the opposite of Bonapartism, the self-organization, self-management, democratic self-control of the mass of people. And therefore, now the term dictatorship of the proletariat is something that I would no longer use today. It's become, so bent out of shape and so defined by Stalinism and Marxism and Leninism to mean the rule of a party and a dictatorship and so forth, that it's simply a reactionary term. I wouldn't use it at all. But the idea of the rule of people The rule of the working people is something I'm all for, but not the rule, not the state rule, not the establishment of a new state, but rather the ending of all states and replacement with radical democracy through councils and committees and so forth, federated together. Whether this fits any other definition of what the liberals, classical liberals, would have thought about it, well, of course they would be against it, because they were against, and I think Helena puts it quite well, they wanted to do good for the people, but they didn't trust the people. And in fact, to this day, one can define liberalism that way. I think Robert F. Kennedy once said something like that. He asked what liberalism meant to him, and he said it meant helping those less fortunate than yourself. And I think that's pretty much the way, the best liberals may think of it that way, but still doing good for others. A lot of these terms, of course, have changed over time. Liberalism, as we're saying, has gone through all kinds of things, where once it meant anti-statism, and now it's used for people who want to do good through the state, which may or may not be positive. I'm not against any particular reform. You have to, to be discussed. But the overall strategy of using the state, I think, is negative and dangerous. And as much as I love Lincoln, who was a great model for me, a great admire Lincoln, love to read Lincoln, and so forth, can't be applied to, he was the last, perhaps, of the great revolutionary leaders of the bourgeois revolution. Since then, it's all been downhill for them. And even then, as we know, the Civil War, the bourgeois democratic demands of political democracy and rights, the freedom of African Americans was betrayed, because the bourgeoisie did not carry out and could not carry out its promises of liberating, liberating the African Americans, liberating the slaves. And particularly, they could not break up the property of the big former slave owners, because well, that was property, and you didn't want to break away property, take away property. Let me see, what was the questions of Bernie and so forth? He calls himself a, well, liberalism, as Helena mentioned, was denounced and trounced by the reactionaries, culminating in Reagan. And so the former liberals picked up the term, they used the word progressive, because it sounded less offensive to people who are against liberalism. The term progressive had been used by the Communist Party, for example, as a way of lumping together Stalinists and pro-capitalist liberals. Nowadays, who knows what any of these terms mean? It's just like the question, who's a progressive, who's a leftist? Sanders is defined in newspapers as the far leftist, which is, really kind of nuts. The most wonderful thing about the current political scene, and there's not much positive going on, but the growth of a movement of people calling themselves socialist, that there are now thousands of people, something like up to 40% to 50% of young people, people regard themselves as socialists, but they usually don't have any idea what it means, or at very least are sympathetic to socialism, or willing to be for change in society and aren't against socialism. This is a very positive thing. And what we're seeing today, the breaking down of the middle and the growth on the far left of vague, at least a vague socialist consciousness, and on the other hand, of course, the growth on the far right. And it's quite true that Spencer says that there's a split here in the state, as there is among the bourgeoisie. One of the most positive things, most interesting things about reading Marx's 18th Brumaire is that, as opposed to the crude model image of Marxism as being, one solid class of capitalists gives orders to the bourgeois, to the state, which deals with a solid class. Actually, Marx shows how there are factions and disputes inside every class, and that they fight against each other, and how they balance each other, and how the state rises to deal with them. And it's all true. That's all true, and it's true today. And we can see with our own eyes, the forces that rise. The mass of the bourgeoisie is not ready for fascism, but on the other hand, there's a trend and a need for a building up of a fascist movement and a fascist potential. And so they're balancing each other. And that's developing that, both on the far right and the far left. building of fascism, the idea, these things, not so very long ago for all of us, who would we have thought that there would be a serious political candidate who call himself socialist, whatever he is, or that the president would be unable to denounce Nazis when they marched publicly? I mean, we're seeing the breaking down of the status quo, this standard society, and the building up of various greater conflicts, which may lead to some kind of Bonapartist attempt by at least on the right, and on the party, social democratic or reform left. So this is all something that we, can learn from and look forward to in the future.
Thank you, Wayne. And go ahead, Spencer.
Unmute.
Yes, sorry. There's a lot to respond to. I'll try to keep it brief. This question that liberals are in some sense afraid of the people. I think that I think that this is a problem if we're going to counterpose liberalism even to the rule of Napoleon, who, after all, famously said, "Tout pour le peuple, rien par le peuple." Right? Not everything for the people, nothing by the people.
Yep.
And so I don't agree that liberals, in a sense, are afraid of the people in the revolution. How could they be? The revolution depends on their participation, and they're very aware of it. What I would say is that that problem of the mob, of the uneducated character of the people, of the rabble, the question of the lumpen proletariat and the lumpenization of the proletariat is a problem for socialists. It's a problem that their politics is an attempt to deal with, right? And so, in other words, the issue that liberals face, if you will, of educating the people is not far into socialism. It is a part of socialist politics. It's why socialists speak of schools for socialism, such as trade unions. The people have to be prepared to run, to take power, to operate. What would it mean to for there to be a working class revolution? That was more than a or something else other than a mob run amok. And I think that that is a real issue in the history of socialism, and no serious socialist ignored it. And it's an issue because of what I want to really talk about, which is that the state, I don't agree with Wayne, can be understood as simply in the service of a class. I think it has to be taken seriously that society needs a savior, that society faces an emergency, that society is faced with a real crisis. And what I would point to is the vast number of morbid symptoms of social disintegration under capital, of every kind of lumpenism, drug addiction, mental health problems, criminality, which this society breeds. And it doesn't breed them in the interests of the bourgeoisie. It breeds them because this society is self-contradictory. And I think, everyone knows that it's a scandal, that the prisons are a scandal, that that so many of these symptoms, whether warehoused by the state or warehoused out of doors, are, belie the claims of this society. And so, as I tell my students, everyone hates the police until you need them. Until you're, in a sense, faced with the criminality and the morbid symptoms and so forth and so on. And that's where the issue of Bonapartism, the issue was asked, what's the relationship of Bonapartism to the dictatorship of the proletariat? The issue for the Marxist strain within socialism is that those disintegrative elements of society, that, in a sense, self-disintegration of society under conditions of capital, won't be wished away by a political, by seizing power, or really by any political act alone, whether undertaken by a majority, a minority. That's not the issue. The issue is, in a sense, the society's problem itself. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that anyone's interested in a coup by a Blancist coup. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that society has, in a sense, already possessed itself. It's already made a revolution. It's created a state to manage its problems. Right, as Marx says, Louis Napoleon steals all of France in order to give it all back. Right, the state serves the whole of society, it serves the peasantry, it serves this class, it serves that class. It's managing a crisis. And so, what Marxism understands a revolution to be about is to be about the working class substituting itself, its own, in a sense, disciplined political, contingent, i.e., unionized workers, etc., for what Engels referred to as bodies of armed men in the state. That the armed men who are, and now women, that the people who manage the social problems, and there is always the armed men standing behind the welfare bureaucrat and the probation officer and the child services officer, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The substitution of the working class for those bodies of armed men. Not, they can't be eliminated immediately. Right, that the problems that they manage should be, will continue because the society isn't created by the state. And so, just you can't, even if the state were gone tomorrow, the society would, in a sense, spontaneously demand another one to manage its crisis. And so, it's that issue that I think. Marx understands, Marx and Engels understand by the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's why I called it critical Bonapartism. You may not agree with it. That's the way I take it.
So with that, on behalf of Platypus, I'd like to extend a warm round of digital applause to our panelists, as well as to our audience for your participation. If you have a response to what you heard tonight that didn't fit in the limitations of the Q&A, you can feel free to write a response or review of the event for the Platypus Review. We'd love to hear from you. You can send an email to editor@platypus1917.org. Also, as part of this weekend's virtual convention, we're hosting one additional panel discussion beginning in just over an hour on the question of socialism in the 21st century. That's going to be taking place live on Zoom beginning at 6 p.m. Central Time. The link has been posted in the chat, and we hope you join us there. If you'd like to join an online platypus reading group, please go to platypus1917.org/virtual. And with that, thank you everyone for an excellent discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Helena.
Wayne,
Thanks, Ed.
Ed. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.